In this exercise, we gave you several sentences and asked you to decide for each one whether or not an indirect object appears. Let's take a look at them one by one. First, Moesha wrote her grandmother a long letter thanking her for the birthday gift. It's usually a good way to start to look for the verb in a sentence like this, and then work from the verb outward. What's the verb in this sentence? The answer is wrote. Wrote is the word that contains the action of the sentence. And who or what is the subject? Who did the writing? The answer, Moesha. Now, is there a direct object? That is there something in the sentence which tells us what Moesha wrote? Something that receives the action of the verb wrote. Yes, what Moesha wrote was a letter, specifically a long letter. So the word letter is the direct object of the verb wrote. It tells us what Moesha wrote. Now the tricky question, is there an indirect object? That is there something in the sentence that tells us to what, to whom, or for whom the letter was written? Well, the letter was written to Moesha's grandmother. And that noun, grandmother, appears in the sentence between the verb and the direct object. Therefore, it's in the right place for an indirect object. And that, in fact, is what it is. So the noun grandmother is the indirect object here. It answers the question, to whom Moesha wrote the letter. And that's the answer for this first question. Next, after 2 days of debate, the town council awarded the road maintenance contract to a company owned by several local citizens. It's a long, complicated sentence, but let's break it down piece by piece, and I think you'll find it's not that difficult to understand. First, what's the verb? What's the action that's happening in this sentence? The answer is awarded. Who or what is the subject of the verb awarded? Who did the awarding? The answer, council, or more specifically, the town council. So council is the subject. Now, is there a direct object? Is there a word that tells us what the town council awarded? Yes, the answer is contract. They awarded the contract, or more specifically, the road maintenance contract. Now, what about an indirect object? Is there a word or phrase that answers the question to whom or to what the road maintenance contract was awarded? Well, the answer in a way is yes, the contract was awarded to a company owned by several local citizens. But this is not being used as an indirect object. Remember, an indirect object would have to be placed between the verb and the direct object. And that's not where the company is placed. The company instead is tacked on at the end of the sentence. Furthermore, notice that the company is mentioned in a prepositional phrase. And as we saw a moment ago, an indirect object is never part of a prepositional phrase. So in this case, company is not an indirect object. Instead, it's part of the prepositional phrase to a company, and therefore it is not, grammatically speaking, an indirect object, even though it answers the same question and conveys much the same meaning. From a grammatical standpoint, it's not an indirect object. Let's look at our next example. Every evening, Richard and Emily cooked us a wonderful meal using fresh ingredients from the local farm stands. What's the verb here? The verb is cooked. That describes the action of the sentence. Who or what did the cooking? Richard and Emily. They are the subject of the verb cooked, and it's, of course, a compound subject because there are two nouns there linked by the coordinating conjunction and. So Richard and Emily cooked. Now, what did they cook? That is, what's the direct object of the verb? What they cooked is a wonderful meal. So the noun meal is the direct object. Now, is there an indirect object, a word that appears between the verb and the direct object, which answers the question to what, to whom, for what, or for whom? Yes, the answer is us. The pronoun us answers the question for whom the wonderful meal was cooked. Lucky us. So us, that pronoun, is the indirect object. It answers the question for whom the meal was cooked, and it appears between the verb and the direct object. So us, that pronoun, is the indirect object in this sentence. Next example. Each candidate prepared a written statement for the selection committee. What's the verb here? The verb is prepared. Who or what did the preparing? Each candidate. So the verb is prepared. What's the direct object? That is, do we know who or what the candidates prepared? Well, they prepared a written statement. So the noun statement is the direct object. Is there an indirect object, a word appearing between the verb and the direct object, which tells to whom or for whom the statement was prepared? The answer is no. There is no indirect object here. Once again, as in a previous example, we have an answer to the question for whom the statement was prepared, but it appears in the form of a prepositional phrase at the end of the sentence, rather than as a true indirect object. So the selection committee is the object of the preposition for, and that's simply a prepositional phrase that gives more information about the action. It really doesn't serve grammatically as an indirect object. So this sentence is another example of one that doesn't contain an indirect object. Our last example. 2 minutes before game time, the coach gave her players a final reminder about the crucial importance of teamwork. What's the verb in this sentence? The verb is gave. Who or what gave? The coach gave. So coach is the subject of the verb gave. Now, who or what did the coach give? What is the direct object of the verb gave? Well, what the coach gave was a reminder, specifically a final reminder. So reminder is the direct object of the verb gave. Now, does the sentence contain an indirect object, a word that tells us to whom or for whom that reminder was given? Yes, the answer is her players. So the noun players, which does appear between the verb and the direct object, is the indirect object in this sentence. It answers the question to whom the coach gave the reminder, and it appears in the proper location in the sentence, and therefore players is the indirect object in this sentence.